We already have seen the effect of the lower refugee numbers that are coming to Utah the last couple of years, and we have seen businesses don't have the manpower that they need to do their businesses.
That was Aiden Batar, Director of Migration and Refugee Services at Catholic Community Services of Utah back in September of 2019, talking about how refugees contribute to Utah's economy. Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight, preparing for more refugees in Utah. When President Biden ran for president, he promised to raise the cap on refugee admissions from 12,000 last year to 125,000 this year. He also promised to double the number of immigration judges, court staff, and interpreters. So what does this mean for Utah, as our state is a center for refugee relocation? Joining us now live via Zoom to talk about this subject is a person you heard at the top of this segment, Aiden Batar, Migration and Refugee Services Director for Catholic Community Services. Batar, it's great to have you on the show. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Batar, could you share a little bit of your own refugee story and what it was like starting a new life in Utah? Were there any resources or people who helped you get settled here in a new country?
Yeah, when we came to Utah in 1994, there weren't Somali refugees here in Utah. We were the first refugees from Somalia to come to Utah. But luckily, we have Catholic Community Services that helped us with the housing, employment, health services, everything that we needed to start a new life. And without the agency, the support, things would not have been, great for us at the time.
It's incredible how you are now in turn working for the agency that helped you get settled. Now, how did Utah become a hub for refugee resettlement?
Utah started resettling refugees back in the 80s when the Refugee Resettlement program started. There are two resettlement agencies, Catholic Community Services and International Rescue Committee, that brings refugees here in Utah. And of course, with the help of the LDS Church, who provides all the support that we need. And also Utah is one of the places in the country that it's well known, the public-private partnership. We have a lot of volunteers. We have a lot of businesses that are hiring refugees. And so ever since, we started refugees, it has been great for refugees to come to Utah.
Yeah, if there's anything that we know about the state of Utah is that we're very giving and welcoming. Do we know how many refugees have been resettled in Utah, and maybe in total and per year?
Yeah, in total, about 60,000 refugees were resettled ever since the program started. And in 2016, we were able to resettle 1,300 refugees in Utah. But the last 4 years with the Trump administration, the refugee numbers were significantly, declined. And the last year, Utah had only resettled less than 300 refugees arrive. And that shows how the numbers, the last 4 years were declining.
Now, Batar, how is a refugee chosen to come to the U.S. and then Utah? What's that process like?
Well, Utah, first, the president will, every year will decide how many refugees that will be coming into the United States. And then the State Department, decides the regional allocation where those refugees are coming from. There are about 9 voluntary agencies in the United States that resettles refugees throughout the country. And in Utah, for example, with Catholic Community Services, we are affiliated with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops throughout the country. That's how refugees are allocated on who is coming to each particular state. So in Utah, every year, our agency, we say these are the number of refugees that we can resettle in looking, the resources that we have, the capacity that we have, and so forth. So historically, every year, Catholic Community Services were resettling between 500 and 600 refugees.
Now, Batar, let's talk about President Biden's executive orders. He's increasing the number of refugees that can come to the country, which in turn will increase the number that can come to Utah. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think this is what we have been waiting for the last 4 years with the refugee numbers to go back to where they were in 2016. So there have been so many families that we have been helping, waiting their loved ones to come to reunite with them. I think this is a great opportunity for those families to reunite with their loved ones, number one. Secondly, there's a lot of businesses that heavily rely on the refugees workforce. Many of those businesses could not fill certain positions. And also our community heavily volunteers who have been waiting to volunteer to the refugees. Now they will get the opportunity again to volunteer to the refugee families so they can, provide those support that they have been always providing to the refugees. I think this is a win-win situation for our refugee community, for our community in general, and also the refugees that have been waiting so long to come to the United States.
Batar, we have about 30 seconds left. What are some final thoughts that you may have on this issue, or anything that you would like our viewers at home to know about tonight?
Well, I think one thing that I would like to let our community to know is, refugees are, are individuals who have been fleeing persecution to come to our community to rebuild their lives. They are safe. We shouldn't worry about them, their safety, and we need to welcome them and provide them the support that they need to become self-reliant.
All right, you've been hearing from Aiden Batar, Director of Migration and Refugee Services for Catholic Community Services. Batar, as always, it's great to talk with you. Thank you for making time to be on our show tonight.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on preparing for more refugees in Utah. Joining us now live via Zoom to talk about the refugee immigration process is Alyssa Williams, the Program Manager for Immigration for Catholic Community Services. Alyssa, thanks for making time to be on the show tonight. It's good to see you.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Let's start the conversation with talking about the significant difference between a potential immigrant and a refugee. Not everybody knows the difference. Could you help explain this for us?
Sure. Sometimes there's a difference, sometimes there's not, depending on where they are applying. So many immigrants will actually apply for a visa or interview overseas, and that's similar to the refugee process, where they're presenting their claim to multiple agencies, interviewing, vetting, having to do medical exams, getting a full clearance before they're able to be admitted into the United States. The Refugee Act has always asked that refugees be admitted in the refugee status and then wait 1 year before they apply for permanent resident status. And that would be a little bit different for somebody who is coming on a spousal visa, that they've already got all their clearances and they would land inside the United States as a permanent resident, which is what we would call an immigrant.
Now, do refugees get any special consideration in the immigration process?
No, not really. They actually have a little bit of a delay because they have to wait that 1 year before they apply for permanent residence. They get that 1 year back when they're trying to apply for citizenship. So they're able to apply for citizenship 5 years from the date of their arrival. But there's not really any special considerations that a refugee would get during the immigration process over, let's say, an immigrant.
Now, where are they located? Not from like a country or a continent perspective, but under what conditions are they living in when they are chosen?
Because refugees have to flee their home country, they usually end up going to a surrounding country and seek shelter and safety usually from UNHCR camps that are set up usually in very rustic conditions with basic needs that are met, but they can be quite unsafe sometimes. The rations can be very meager. And so the refugees often, because they've lived sometimes for tens of years in a refugee camp, are quite desperate for permanent resettlement.
Now, what kind of resources and assistance are provided to them to help them settle into their new life here in the U.S.?
So when they arrive, the refugee resettlement agencies do screening to make sure that they understand medical needs, maybe even some of the emotional needs that the refugee might have. And then they're immediately screened for viability for jobs, their ability to take a job, apply for jobs, make sure that they're getting up and working as quickly as possible so they're able to provide for their families. And then they receive lots of different orientations about life in the United States, life in the state where they live, so that they have better understanding of how, the new environment that's welcoming them in.
How does it work when one family member is chosen to be relocated in the U.S.? Does the whole family get to come?
Unfortunately not. So generally, I would say that the principal applicant who's applying for refugee status and asserting their claim for protection because of a fear of persecution might be a parent of maybe 5 or 6 children, for example. And so obviously those children and that person's spouse would be able to be resettled with them. But if the person's mother is very close to them, that mother wouldn't necessarily be able to come at the same time. She would have to present her own claim and get her own approval. The mom might be resettled to Sweden, the daughter and her children might be resettled to the United States. And it could be that the reason that the woman doesn't have her husband in the camp is because they were separated during war. And so the hope is that the husband might find her and the children while they're still in the camp. But if not, then when they arrive in the United States, one of the things that we do is try to help reunite that family by, if the woman is finally able to locate her husband, trying to file a petition with the Immigration Service to share her refugee status, even though she's already here in the United States.
What a difficult experience for these families. They go through so much before they even make it to the U.S. Now, immigration reform is a big topic these days, one that is being debated in D.C. right now. What reforms would you like to see pertaining to refugees?
Some of the reforms that are going into effect now are policy reforms that are trying to restore our asylum system and our asylum process to the asylum we've always had, and not the new asylum that was very harsh that the previous administration tried to implement. But the new bill that Biden had recommended, and the Senate version of the bill that I've been looking at most specifically, does a lot of beautiful things. It's trying to help some of the problems that we've had in the immigration system for a long time, trying to promote more family unity. That would obviously help refugees, because as they're becoming permanent residents, maybe they end up getting married to somebody that is back in the camp, and they would like to be able to bring that husband here. And so the family, reunification and unity programs in the bill are great. There are also some refugee-specific provisions that are trying to help promote integration of refugees. But one of the biggest programs is kind of finally, for us that have been watching the Central American refugee crisis, trying to implement a better system of screening and vetting and interviewing refugees that are fleeing persecution and war, like in Venezuela, and some of the tragic conditions that are in the Central American countries, actually be able to interview them and help offer the refugee assistance that we see in other areas of the world, so that we don't have quite as many asylum seekers that are on the move, putting their lives in danger to try to reach the U.S. border.
All right, you've been hearing from Alyssa Williams, Program Manager for Immigration at Catholic Community Services. Alyssa, thank you for making time to be part of our discussion tonight.
Thank you so much.
Taking refugees who are coming to the United States legally and helping them to gain those job skills and life skills that will help them succeed as first-generation Americans and raise successful kids that can give back to our society.
That was former U.S. Representative Ben McAdams a year ago, talking about the value and contributions that refugees add to communities and to Utah. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on preparing for more refugees in Utah. When people flee from their country during extreme events such as violence, war, and natural disaster, sometimes families get separated or lost. Some of the refugees seeking asylum are unaccompanied minors. So we wanted to know what happens to them as they're getting resettled. Joining us now via Zoom is Erica Astor, the Refugee Foster Care Program Manager for Catholic Community Services. Erica, thanks for making time to be part of our conversation tonight, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Erica, let's start our conversation by talking about the need for foster care for refugees. What can you tell us about this?
So refugees, as you said, sometimes are separated from their parents during the war experience. And so then those youth end up without their families and their caregivers and are still in need of the same safety and refuge that other refugees need. So as Batar talked earlier, CCS resettles adults and families, but we also resettle unaccompanied minors, and they need foster care similar to the state foster care system to provide loving families for them.
Erica, do we know what percentage of refugees are unaccompanied minors?
So minors account for about 14% of the total migrant population. And out of that 14%, how many of them are unaccompanied fluctuates every year and depending on what country you're looking at.
Now, what are some of the circumstances that lead to an underage refugee to come to the United States by themselves?
So sometimes youth are fleeing mandatory military service. Sometimes during war, they're separated from their parents, and so they end up in a refugee camp by themselves. Sometimes they experience trafficking or recruitment to gangs or drug cartels that they're trying to flee. So there are a lot of reasons why they end up alone, and then it is determined that it's in their best interest to come here as an unaccompanied refugee minor.
Now, refugees typically flee from their native country because of circumstances that can mean life or death for them. What's the mental or emotional impact that it might have on a child or a teen to go through something like this, and how does a foster family take this into consideration?
Yeah, it's definitely something that foster families need to take into consideration because parenting is hard, parenting teenagers is hard, and in addition to the normal hormonal changes that teenagers are going through, youth really need a stable environment during those formative years. And so when those years are disrupted by war and by violence, and you're experiencing trauma at an early age, it impacts them in lots of different ways. The biggest thing I think is that in addition to them maybe struggling to trust or to build new relationships with people, they also are extremely resilient, and they've been able to survive something that a lot of people couldn't have survived. And so foster parents should take that into consideration as well. That these youth, in some ways, they might respond to their trauma in different ways, and one of the ways could be strength and growth.
Now, Erica, what does Catholic Community Services do to help these children in Utah, and what is your organization's primary needs with helping foster these children?
Yes, so what we do to help them is we have a team that works directly with the youth and works directly with the foster families as well to support them, to help the youth acclimate to this new environment, to set goals, to plan for their future, to not just survive, but really thrive and make a life for themselves here. And we hope that they, with the support of Catholic Community Services, they're preparing for self-sufficiency so they can pay their own bills and speak enough English to get by. But we also hope that they'll have long-term supportive adults in their lives. And that's why our biggest need is foster families. As Biden has announced higher numbers of refugees, that means higher numbers of refugee minors. And we can only accept a new case if we have a home for that case. And so in order to prepare for higher numbers of refugees, we need higher numbers of foster families who can love and care for these youth.
A lot of good being done in the community, and such a selfless act on all ends, especially with foster families, to take in these vulnerable individuals and help them resettle into the community and becoming contributing members of society. All right, you've been hearing from Erica Astor, Program Manager for Foster Care for Catholic Community Services. Erica, thank you so much for joining our conversation tonight. It was good to have you.
Thank you. Have a good night.